The old house at the end of Hollow Creek Road had been abandoned for years, a decaying monument to the tragedy that once unfolded there. No one dared step foot inside, not since the night the Holloway family vanished without a trace. Some said they moved away in the dead of night, others whispered of something far worse. But when Daniel, a young urban explorer with a thirst for the unknown, decided to investigate, he had no idea that the truth would be far more horrifying than any rumor. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and his camera, he pushed open the creaking door, stepping into the darkness that swallowed him whole. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of dust and rot. Cobwebs clung to the walls like veins, stretching into the endless black of the long-forgotten home. His footsteps echoed, a lonely sound in the vast emptiness. He had expected signs of squatters, graffiti, maybe even a few broken bottles. But the house was untouched, frozen in time. The furniture remained exactly as it had been left, a dinner table still set for a meal that had never been eaten, chairs slightly pulled out, a single candle burned down to a stub. It was as if the family had stood up mid-bite and simply disappeared. Daniel's breath came slow and steady, but his heart pounded in his chest. Something was wrong here. His flashlight flickered as he moved further inside, illuminating family portraits on the wall. The faces stared back at him, hollow and lifeless, their eyes seeming to follow his every move. He shook off the uneasy feeling and pressed on, his camera rolling. That's when he saw it. The basement door, slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness beckoning him forward. A wave of nausea washed over him, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he couldn't. He had come too far. With a trembling hand, he pushed the door open and descended the stairs. The wooden steps groaned beneath his weight, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, his light flickered again before stabilizing, revealing something that made his blood run cold. The walls were covered in deep scratches, as if something or someone had tried desperately to escape. And in the center of the room, a single chair sat facing the wall, its arms bound with thick, rotting rope. That's when he heard it. A whisper, faint, almost too soft to be real. "Help me." Daniel spun around, his flashlight darting across the room, but there was nothing, just silence. His breath hitched. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Help me." The air turned ice cold, his fingers numb around the flashlight. And then, movement. A shadow shifted in the corner, something hunched and unnatural. It twitched, its limbs moving in jerky, inhuman motions. His body locked in place, his every muscle screaming at him to run, but he was frozen in fear. The shadow lurched forward, and for the first time he saw it clearly. A figure, gaunt, hollow-eyed, its mouth twisted in a silent scream. Its skin was stretched too tight over its bones, its fingers long and clawed, and those eyes black, endless voids, filled with something ancient and unspeakable. The thing let out a breathy wheeze, its lips peeling back into a grotesque grin. Daniel stumbled backward, his heel catching on the stairs as he scrambled to escape. The flashlight fell from his grasp, rolling across the floor, its beam flickering wildly. The whispers turned to wails, desperate and hungry. Hands, cold, skeletal hands, brushed against his ankle, sending a jolt of terror through him. He kicked, thrashing violently as he clawed his way up the stairs, the air thick with the stench of decay. He didn't dare look back. He couldn't. His fingers found the door handle, yanking it open with a strength he didn't know he had. He threw himself into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind him, but the whisper followed. "Help me." A chill slithered down his spine as he bolted from the house, the walls seeming to close in around him. He didn't stop running until he was miles away, his breath ragged, his heart threatening to burst from his chest. He never spoke of what he saw that night. But sometimes, when the air is still and the night is quiet, he swears he can still hear it, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A whisper carried on the wind. "Help me." The morning air was thick with tension, the flashing red and blue lights casting eerie shadows across the cemetery. David stood motionless, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his gaze fixed on the open coffin. The numbness had settled deep in his bones, making everything around him feel distant, almost unreal. The officers moved with practiced efficiency, their murmured conversations blending with the rustling leaves. Detective Harris, a tall, stern woman with piercing eyes, approached him, her expression unreadable. "You the one who called?" she asked, her voice calm yet firm. David swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, my mother. She was buried alive. I found her like this. His own words felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else. Detective Harris cast a sharp glance at the coffin before motioning for the forensic team to begin their work. This is a serious accusation, she said, turning back to David. Can you tell me why you decided to dig up the grave? David inhaled shakily, trying to keep his emotions in check. She didn't just die. Something was wrong. The funeral was rushed, and my father, he's been acting strange ever since. I had to know the truth. The detective took down notes, her expression unreadable. And your father? Where is he now? At home, I think, David answered, his voice flat. He doesn't know I'm here. Harris studied him for a moment before signalling to one of her officers. Bring the father in for questioning, and get the medical examiner here ASAP. We need to confirm what happened. David's stomach twisted at the thought of his father being questioned. He knew Mark Holloway would be livid when he found out what David had done, but none of that mattered anymore. Not after what he had uncovered. The forensic team worked quickly, documenting every horrifying detail, the deep scratches on the inside of the coffin lid, the broken, bloodied nails, the faint bruises circling Clara's wrists. Every piece of evidence pointed to the unthinkable truth. She had fought to get out. She had died alone in the suffocating dark, buried before her time. The medical examiner arrived moments later, kneeling beside the coffin with a grim expression. There are clear signs of asphyxiation, he murmured, mostly to himself. Livor mortis suggests she was alive for several hours after burial. This wasn't a mistake. David clenched his fists so tightly his nails dug into his palms. His mother hadn't died of a heart attack. She had been murdered. The realization sent ice through his veins. Someone had done this to her, and he had a sickening suspicion of who. Minutes later, an officer returned, his voice cutting through the hushed air. Sir, we have the father in custody. He's demanding to know what's going on. David's pulse pounded in his ears. His father, the man who had been avoiding his eyes since the funeral, the man who had rushed through every detail of Clara's burial, who had refused to let David see her body one last time. Had it really been grief, or had it been guilt? Detective Harris turned to David, her expression grim. Son, I need you to be honest with me. Do you think your father had something to do with this? The words stuck in his throat, but deep down he already knew the answer. His father's distant stares, the way he had refused to speak about Clara's death, the eerie silence that had settled over their home ever since. It all made sense now. I don't know, David whispered, but the look in his eyes told a different story. The detective nodded, as if she understood. We're going to find out. David watched as the officers led his father through the cemetery gates. Mark Holloway's face was a mask of rage and something else, something darker. But David didn't flinch. He had uncovered the truth, and he wouldn't stop until justice was served. On between them, but she never confronted him. She said she wanted to keep the family together, no matter what. But I think she was scared of what he might do if she pushed too hard. David's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. Detective Harris leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. Scared? Did she ever say he hurt her? David shook his head. Not in so many words, but she told me once that my father had a temper, that he could be cruel when he wanted to be. I never saw him lay a hand on her, but I did see the way she would flinch sometimes when he raised his voice. And then, after she died, he moved on too fast, like he had been waiting for it. Harris jotted something down, then met his eyes. And Evelyn? How did she react to your mother's death? David exhaled sharply, shaking his head. She played the grieving friend, but it was an act. She was always around after Mom died, comforting my father, taking care of things like she belonged there. And he let her. It was like my mother had never existed. Harris tapped her pen against her notebook. You think she and your father were involved before Clara's death? I know they were, David said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. I just don't know how far they were willing to go to be together. Harris nodded. All right, we're going to look into both of them. In the meantime, you should go home, get some rest. This is going to be a long process. David scoffed under his breath. Rest? After what I just found? After knowing my mother was buried alive? He shook his head. I can't rest until I know the truth." Harris regarded him for a long moment before closing her notebook. "I get it, but let us do our job. If someone did this, we'll find out." David left the station feeling hollow, his mind racing. His father, Evelyn, the rushed funeral. It all fit together in a sickening way. Had they planned this? Had his mother been in the way of whatever future they wanted? His stomach twisted at the thought. As he stepped outside into the crisp morning air, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message. Unknown number. With shaking fingers, he opened it. "You should have left it alone." David's blood turned to ice. Someone knew what he had done, and they were watching. Detective Harris didn't flinch. She had dealt with men like Mark Holloway before, calm, composed, and utterly convinced of their own control over a situation. But she had seen the flicker of panic in his eyes, and that was enough. "Your son may be grieving, but the evidence speaks for itself," she said evenly. "And right now it's telling a very different story than the one you're giving me." Mark scoffed, crossing his arms. "This is ridiculous. My wife is dead, and now my son is dragging me through this circus because he can't accept it?" His voice was laced with irritation, but there was something beneath it, something guarded. Harris studied him carefully before flipping through her notes. "Let's talk about the life insurance policy," she said. "From what we understand, Clara had a sizable policy in place, and since her passing, you stand to inherit a significant amount, along with ownership of the house. That's a pretty compelling reason to want her gone, wouldn't you say?" Mark's jaw twitched. "Are you accusing me of something, Detective?" "I'm just following the facts." She tapped her pen against the file. "And then there's Evelyn." For the first time, Mark shifted in his chair, his fingers tightening on the armrests. David, sitting in the next room, clenched his fists as he watched through the one-way mirror. He could see it now. His father wasn't the unshakable man he had always believed him to be. He was unraveling, piece by piece. Harris continued, pressing in. "David told us about her, how she's been around more since Clara's death, how you two seemed close even before that." She leaned in slightly. "Were you having an affair, Mark?" Mark's lips pressed into a thin line, his silence answering for him. Harris nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." She flipped to another page. "And you see, that's where things get interesting. Clara suspected you were cheating, didn't she?" David said she had her doubts. She paused, watching Mark's reaction. "Maybe she confronted you. Maybe she threatened to leave. And if she did, well, that would have been quite the inconvenience for you, wouldn't it? Losing the house, the money. But if she were to pass away unexpectedly, everything would be yours. No messy divorce, no financial losses." Mark's nostrils flared. "You have no proof of that." Harris didn't blink. "Maybe not yet, but we will." The silence in the room was heavy, stretching between them like a tightening noose. Mark swallowed, but his face remained blank. David's heart pounded. He had spent so long questioning himself, doubting his instincts. But now, as he watched his father sit there, stone-faced, deflecting, refusing to grieve, he knew his mother had been right to be afraid. And David wasn't going to stop until he got justice. David stood frozen on the steps of the police station, his breath shallow as he stared at the message on his phone. "You think it's over?" It's not. The words sent a chill through his spine, colder than the morning air. His father was in custody. Evelyn would be next. So who was still out there? Who else had been involved? He turned, scanning the street, his heart pounding. The world around him felt different now, darker, more dangerous. Every passing face seemed like a potential threat. His mind raced through the possibilities. Could it be someone else close to his mother? Someone who had helped cover it up? Before he could think further, Detective Harris stepped out of the station behind him. "David?" Her voice was steady, but laced with concern. He swallowed hard and turned to face her. "I just got another message," he said, handing her the phone. She frowned as she read it, her expression darkening. "Whoever this is, they're still watching me." Harris sighed, handing the phone back. "We'll trace the number, but if there's someone else involved, we need to be careful." She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Go home, David. Try to get some rest." Rest, as if that was possible. He nodded numbly and walked away, his body moving on autopilot. His mother had been buried alive, betrayed by the man who was supposed to love her. The thought made his stomach churn. The worst part wasn't just the act itself. It was how easily they had gotten away with it. If he hadn't followed his gut, if he hadn't dug up her grave, the truth would have stayed buried forever. As he neared his house, dread crept in. The home he had once felt safe in now felt like a crime scene. He stepped inside, every creak of the floorboards setting him on edge. The air was stale, heavy with the weight of what had happened. His father's presence still lingered here, in the untouched furniture, the photographs on the walls. He clenched his fists. This house had belonged to his mother, not to the man who had taken her life. His phone buzzed again. Another message. "You should have left it alone." David's blood turned to ice. His hands tightened around the phone as he forced himself to breathe. Whoever this was, they weren't done. They were still out there, still watching. His gaze drifted to the window, to the quiet street beyond. Someone was in the shadows, waiting. This wasn't over, and David wasn't going to stop until he found them. The officers stood firm, their faces unreadable as Evelyn Carter stared at them, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Detective Harris took a step forward, her voice calm but authoritative. "Evelyn Carter, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to remain silent." Evelyn's composure shattered instantly. "What? This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything." She shrieked, struggling against the officers as they grabbed her wrists. David stepped forward, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "You helped him. You gave him the drugs. You knew what he was going to do to my mother." For a fleeting moment, Evelyn's eyes widened in genuine shock, but just as quickly her expression hardened. A slow, cold smile crept onto her lips. "Your mother was weak," she spat. "She didn't deserve him. Mark and I, we were meant to be together. She was in the way." David's fists clenched at his sides, but he refused to let her see how deeply her words cut him. "You're a monster," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you." The officers didn't hesitate. They snapped the cuffs around Evelyn's wrists and began leading her toward the waiting squad car. She thrashed and cursed, but it was no use. Justice had finally caught up with her. Detective Harris turned to David. "We need you to testify in court. This case is strong, but your testimony will make it airtight." David swallowed hard, the thought of facing his father and Evelyn in court making his stomach churn. But he knew he couldn't back down. "I'll do whatever it takes." The trial was swift and brutal. Mark and Evelyn's own confessions, combined with the overwhelming evidence from Clara's exhumation, left little room for doubt. The jury returned with their verdict in record time, guilty on all charges. Mark and Evelyn were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered their fate. David sat in the gallery, his emotions tangled in a mess of relief, grief, and finality. His mother was gone. Nothing would ever bring her back, but at least her killers had been brought to justice. After the trial, David returned to the cemetery. He stood before his mother's grave, the headstone now adorned with fresh flowers. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the grass. "It's over, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They're gone. They can't hurt anyone else." He knelt down, placing a hand on the cold stone. "I miss you every day, but I'll make you proud, I promise." As he stood, a gentle breeze brushed against his face, carrying with it the faint scent of his mother's favourite perfume. He closed his eyes, feeling her presence, warm and comforting, as if she were standing right beside him. A tear slipped down his cheek, but this time it wasn't just from grief. It was from peace. "I love you, Mom." For the first time in months, David felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. The road ahead would still be long, but he knew he wasn't alone. His mother's love would always be with him, guiding him, protecting him. As he walked away from the cemetery, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. He took a deep breath, a sense of calm washing over him. He had faced the darkness, and he had come out stronger. No matter what lay ahead, he knew he would be okay. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon so you never miss another chilling tale.